Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of our series looking back at the great Bud Grant, in which we dig deep into the archives and find some stories that you have probably never heard before about Bud. And thanks again to our friend and great NFL researcher Colin, aka Jaguar Gator 9 on YouTube, for helping with this project. Alright, let's get right into our next Bud story. When you think of when NFL teams usually arrive to their stadium for the game, you're talking about a couple hours beforehand. If you get to the game as a fan right when the gates open, you'll see players already warming up, quarterbacks loosening their arms, the specialists, kickers, and punters warming up their legs, testing how far they can kick the ball, and everyone else stretching. However, let's just say that Bud Grant did not feel that that was the right way to go about it. Not in the slightest bit. He believed that arriving at the stadium early for games was completely pointless. There are even some stories about him hunting on Sunday mornings and then arriving to the stadium only 40 minutes before kickoff, which seems insane today because most teams are already done warming up at the 40-minute mark and are off the field. And here was Bud Grant arriving just to the game as it was about to start. The reason for Grant's late arriving philosophy was simple. If you arrive too early to the stadium, you'll have too much time to kill and you'll lose concentration. Get there right before the game and you can be in game mode and stay focused all the way through. Plus, you don't have all that time beforehand to get dressed and warm up. You can easily do that in an hour. Obviously, this strategy worked out incredibly well for Grant and his Vikings, seeing how they were successful and they were one of the most formidable opponents for the NFC throughout the 1970s. But there was one game where this strategy backfired on him in a big way. And I don't mean in terms of the Vikings being ill-prepared or not warmed up, but what's the risk that you take when you plan on arriving just before an event, no matter what it is? A party, meeting, a football game? You risk the possibility of traffic and arriving late. And during a 1976 game against the Detroit Lions, the Vikings arrived late to their own game. Here's the situation going into the game. It's week 3, and we've got a big NFC Central matchup on our hands at Pontiac Metropolitan Stadium in Detroit between the Vikings and the Lions. It's been a pretty solid start to the season for Minnesota. They are 1-0-1 with a point differential of plus 31, which was the third best in the NFC through 2 weeks, only behind the Cowboys and St. Louis Cardinals. However, with the Chicago Bears leading the division early with a 2-0 record and Detroit having one win, if the Vikings lost this game, they risked falling off the pace early for an NFC title and possibly winning the division for the 4th straight season. And the bad news for the Vikings was that in 1975, they lost to the Lions 17-10, which was one of their 2 losses on the year. Despite that, Minnesota wasn't changing up anything for this game in Pontiac. They were staying at the same hotel, 10 miles away from the stadium. They were going to leave at the same time, 11:45, just 75 minutes before game time, and they were going to be set to arrive at the stadium at noon in accordance with Grant's philosophy and not leaving to the stadium early. At least that was the plan, but even the best laid plans can go awry, because you would think that weather wouldn't play a part in this game since it was inside of a dome. However, if you've ever been on the road in your life, you know if it's raining outside, people don't know how to drive and the roads become a mess. And sure enough, when the Vikings were driving to the stadium in the rain, guess what they encountered along the way? Accidents. Lots of accidents that created a giant traffic jam and made it impossible to move, closing lanes on the highway. What was supposed to be a noon arrival was nowhere close to that. 12 o'clock turned to 12:10, which turned to 12:20, which turned to 12:30, and at 12:45, the Vikings bus, with the game scheduled to kick off in 15 minutes, was still stuck on the highway 5 miles away from the stadium. The team was going to be late for its own game. Now, a lot of the Vikings players, in an effort to stay loose and not stress about something out of their control, were joking about the entire incident. Most notably, safety Paul Krause rolled down the window and yelled to a kid in a Buick next to the bus, asking him what time the game was. The boy was panicking and said 1 o'clock, and Krause yelled back, You want to bet it won't start early? Quarterback Fran Tarkenton jokingly ribbed general manager Mike Lynn and said the team must have gotten the information on how long it would take to the stadium from Russ Thomas, the GM of the Lions. He also said he was going to sue someone because he needed 30 minutes to warm up his arm and he was going to get hurt and lose 10 years off his playing career. However, despite all the joking around, the point still remained that the Vikings bus was stuck on the highway and not at the game. When the stadium was finally in sight, 3 or 4 miles away, the Vikings took matters into their own hands. At that point, they weren't just a football team, they were an all-out traffic control team. Team official Steve Pinkham got out of the bus and directed traffic, while GM Mike Lynn ordered the bus driver to drive on the shoulders and create their own lane to get to the stadium. The good news was that this strategy worked, and the bus was finally able to move, and the team got there at 12:53, just 7 minutes before the game was scheduled to kick off. A good chunk of the 77,000 fans were already in their seats, eagerly waiting for the Lions to play their opponent, and yet their opponent was just arriving at the venue. And as you can expect, the game did not start on time, although it was at the insistence, amazingly enough, of Detroit Lions head coach Rick Forzano. He could have easily had the game start at 1 o'clock, with the Vikings kicking off just 5 minutes after getting off the bus and hustling around and getting dressed with no warm-up at all, but Forzano did not want that. He understood where the Vikings were coming from and told the officials, make sure they warm up so no one gets hurt, and will warm up at the same time. With that, the Vikings got in a quick 10-minute warm-up, and the game, which was supposed to start at 1, was delayed just 30 minutes, and the Vikings were assessed a 15-yard penalty since NFL rules dictate that a team arriving late starts the game penalized 15 yards. But despite the absolute chaos in terms of the Vikings getting to the stadium, somehow this completely accidental strategy of theirs worked. Despite arriving at the stadium 5 minutes before when the game was originally supposed to kick off, the Vikings actually won, taking the game by a score of 10-9. By no means was it a great performance. The team averaged 3.3 yards per carry and amassed only 52 net passing yards. And Fran Tarkenton wasn't kidding when he said he needed more time to warm up his arm, because on this day, he was just 7 for 16 with 47 yards and a passer rating of 51. And the Vikings had no plays during the entire game that went over 20 yards. Yet, the defense did not need to be warmed up. They forced 2 turnovers and held the Lions barely over 3 yards per carry and had a goal line stand late in the game, and most impressively racked up 7 sacks on quarterback Greg Landry. A fourth quarter touchdown run by Chuck Foreman made all the difference in this 1-point victory. Grant said afterwards that obviously, quote, we didn't plan it this way, it just happened. But as frustrating as it may have been to get to the venue and to start the game with a 15-yard penalty, seeing how the game ended, I don't think Bud Grant and company were complaining at the end of the day. Because this game is a true lesson of the phrase, it's not how you start, rather how you finish. Thanks again for watching another part of our series on the great Bud Grant. We will continue to honor the greatest Vikings coach with another part in this series coming up. Make sure you check that out as well.